Alright, so if you've watched all those videos, you have a pretty good understanding of sound, and from what we talked about, you have a pretty good understanding of synthesis. So basically, the first thing I want to address is that, when we're talking about samplers, that, there's a lot of samplers out there, but the basic concept is that it's going to take a sampled piece of audio and play it back. And it may either have very, limited synthesis tools available, or it may have very, extravagant synthesis tools. And, at what point is there it's, got some basic parameters to do some basic adjustments to whatever, sample file you put in there, or, that it's as elaborate as a really good synthesizer for using it in conjunction with a synthesizer to create some wild sounds. I'll do that with like my multi-instrument we talked about, where I'll have the sampler on one side and the synth on the other, but they're separate. And then I start combining them together, the sound. So that's normally how I go about doing that. But, that's a huge topic. So, basically we want to look at some of the basic things other than the synthesis that might be in there. And one of the first topics I want to look at is we talked about, sound fonts. Inside of a sampler and a sound font sampler. We briefly, talked about that. And then I suggest you download this program called Polyphone. And what you can take, like, there's Sound Font and MuseScore that's a free notation software that you can actually make a copy of, pull it out of there, and then put it in here to take a look at it. And I suggest you do, because you can go through there and, look at exactly, how the thing is actually building sound fonts, from the actual samples to the instruments. You can go into the presets, how the presets are put together, and really get an understanding of how it's put together, so that, that concept and all the concepts. So when you've got a sound font file inside your sampler, then you got a pretty good understanding how it's put together. And if you really get into doing some sound sculpting, you're going to want to get some type of, sound font editor. Anyway, this one's free. There's that other one I told you about that was Vienna. So I really suggest you download it and get that sound font, or buy a sound font, or download some other one, and really go through it. Spend a couple days in the evening and look through it, so you can really have a lot better understanding what's happening in your sampler. Alright, the other thing on the sampler, we've addressed most of the modules and things like that. So whatever your sampler that you're looking at, that, I'm hoping that you can take a look at it after watching the videos on sound and the videos we've done so far, and have a pretty good understanding of what the modules and what most of those parameters are doing, whether or not you're looking at that sound font editor sampler, or a normal, just a basic sampler, or like a drum sampler. That, if you're dealing with any of those kind of samplers, with those, I kind of broke them into that, because that's kind of the way how I use a sampler, is a drum sampler, a basic sampler, or I'll use a sound font sampler that, and together with synthesizers to do most work that I'm doing that's working with my DAW. And so, what else could we be looking at when we're talking about those samplers? Let's take a look at some of the other things that those samplers can do. Alright, the first thing is, let's just take a look at this drum, sample player. Now, all the parameters of the pitch, the filter, the amplifier, we're pretty familiar with all these. This isn't ADSR, it's HD, attack, hold, and decay, but we can understand the concept real easy from what we understand so far. And we understand each time we touch one of these that all these parameters are available to address to that individual tom or that individual sample. So that's pretty easy. Next. Alright, another simple concept is offset start. Here on this one, you've got an offset start, and you can offset the ending of the sample. That's a pretty simple concept. Also, you have multiple stereo or mono tracks that you can put that onto their outputs, but they'll basically go to their separate bus in your console. So, multiple stereo or mono tracks is a possibility, in more than likely in your sample. Alright, each one of these pads can hold multiple samples. That way that you can play them in different ways, or do things like round robin, or, you know, velocity, or you can do things like random, which we'll get to. And also on there that you can also right click it and get some other things, you know, that you're able to do with it, some other instructions. So select and pull, rename pad, add sample, replace sample, clear plat, one-shot poly, one-shot mono, some basic instructions or commands by just right clicking it. You can assign different keys to each pad. First trigger, second trigger, that's pretty simple, being able to assign different keys so you can set up your own patterns on the keyboard for each individual set. Alright, one-shot poly means that you can trigger a note and it'll keep playing. If you trigger another note while that one's still sounding, it'll continue to sound to the end of the sample. One-shot mono, it'll stop. So if I hit this drum pad and I hit this one before that one finishes the sample, that it'll automatically stop when I hit that one. Toggle, that basically means that if I'm hitting this and I hit it again, that it automatically stop the actual sample from playing. And note on, note off, basically whenever I hit that on the keyboard, the note on, note off from MIDI, you'd have to go back and look at the video series I did on MIDI. When it gets fed note on from the MIDI, it triggers a sample. When it gets fed note off, then it stops the sample. Alright, you can sync this here with the actual tempo of the song. Some other parameters here are velocity, round robin, and random. Round robin means if you've got 5 samples on this actual pad here, that it'll pay. If you place random, what it'll do is every time you hit it, it might play the first sample, then you hit it again and it might play the 4th sample, you hit it again, it might hit the 2nd sample, and so on and so forth. It's random. Round robin will be if you got 5 samples on there and you hit it the first time, it plays the first sample, you hit it the second time, it might hit it the second sample, the third time it'll hit the third sample, and the 4th time the 4th, the next time the 5th, and then the next time it hits, it'll go back to the 1st. So it just goes in a circle, round robin, something like that. And then velocity, if you've got 5 samples on here, like this one's on, there's 3 samples on this one, and if you're going by velocity and you want to hit it at different hards, so if you've got velocity on your keyboard set up to where if you hit it soft, the first pad will trigger, or the first sample. If you hit it a little bit medium, the second sample will trigger on that pad. And if you hit it real hard, the third sample will trigger. And you can adjust the velocities for how hard you'd be hitting. So you'd be hitting that one soft to trigger it. You'd be hitting that one medium to trigger it. And you'd be hitting that one hard to trigger it. And that would basically be setting up the velocities so they trigger different samples. So it's more realistic to where you can put quiet, you know, drum hits like a tom that's quiet, another sample of that tom that's medium, and another sample of that tom that's really loud. You can also zoom in on the sample a little bit, take a look at it a little bit closer, a little more micro view of the sample if you'd like. This velocity here on here actually adjusts so that the harder you hit the drum, that the velocity on it, that it detunes it a little bit, like the actual skin on the drum's getting stretched. Or you can go either way, so it sounds like it's getting stretched or relaxed more, for depending on how hard you hit the drum. Alright, also that you have stretch factor here, so if you are looking on here and you're looking at the waveform, you can see it's on 1. Watch when it goes to 2. It stretches it. So it's got a stretch factor that you can actually stretch the waveform. And choke is that, let's say I want this bass drum and this snare in a group. So I would choose this one and that one in group 1. And I choose those both ones in that group, and I group them into choke, into that group, that first group. That way if I hit the bass drum and it's ringing out, when I hit the snare, that it automatically silences the bass drum, so that it, you know, it almost like takes over the sound, just like when we were kind of talking about the play mode in one-shot mono, one-shot poly, but a little bit differently so you can set it up for different groups. And it has adjustable filters, low pass filters, band pass filters, high pass filters, and things like that. And we've already discussed those and hopefully already understand about high and low pass filters and band pass filters. So, I mean, that's just the basics of it and some of the things that could be adjusted on it. And let's look at my sample 1. Okay, first of all, with this sampler, you just drag a sample in from your file, and you've got the sample in there. Pretty simple, or you just choose add a file and go into Explorer and add the file. Delete the file or edit the file. Alright, in this sampler, wherever I drug it from, it knows where I drug it from now. So I can choose the previous file or the next file that basically where it came from, the sample player knows where it came from in there. And to actually, the thing with the sample, this sample is recorded and the frequency was A440. It was the frequency. So you want to set that up here in the root C at A4, right? Or A3, depending where it is on the keyboard, how you want it set up. Whatever frequency is on your keyboard, check on your keyboard to see what frequency it's going to say. So you basically have set that up to where that A440 is set at A4 so that it sounds exactly the way it's supposed to sound. And then you pick a range so that you have a set range, like it sounds good between A4 and when it goes up to A5 and A6, that it still sounds pretty good as the pitch changes, but when it goes up to A7, it doesn't sound as good because, you know, it's actually modulating, it's changing the frequency, raising or lowering the frequency. So you pick the key range and the low to high range of where you're going to let that sample play. So when you're playing an A4, that, you know, it's going to go up, you're going to assign that between the low range of how low it'll go and the high range of how low it'll go. So it'll play those pitches with that sample on your keyboard. And then, you know, depending on how many samples it'll cover and still sound good, some samples you put all the way across the keyboard so that they cover the entire range of the keyboard, and some will only sound good with between a range of 3 or 4 notes, you know, that they still sound good where you don't need to get another sample that might be C, you know, C4 or something like that, or C5 or something like that. So that's real simple to understand. We've talked about the monophonic, polyphonic, the glide and the glide time. And, you know, the pitch bend range is going to be really related to the pitch here. And if you're using the LFO, that the actual range on it. And, or on this one, it directly related to your keyboard, your MIDI controller, of what the range it'll let bend that note. Alright, here you also have, you can loop the sample. That way if you strike it here and it goes and plays through the sample, when it gets to the end of the sample, it'll just end. So if you want it to loop, you'll pick a section in the sample time frame here so that when you hit it and it play and it hits this point, it'll start looping so that if you hold the key down, you'll continue hearing that sound from that sample. Because if you don't have a loop on it, you'll hit it when it starts, it'll play it to the end of the sample and then stop. So that's pretty easy to understand. Alright, and the wheel, we had said that the wheel parameter, all the other parameters we've already addressed. But the wheel here is going to adjust with the modulation wheel. So if you actually use not the pitch bend wheel, but the modulation wheel on your workstation or your keyboard, that's going to adjust how much modulation in the filter happens, and it's going to adjust how much modulation happens in the amplitude and how much modulation happens in the LFO. So that's pretty simple. The LFO over here can either be synced so that it's in time with the beats, or it can be free and you set the LFO speed here. So that's pretty simple to understand, and whatever type of waveform that you want to use for your LFO. Pretty simple. So we've kind of looked at that one and some of the parameters on that, and that's pretty simple to understand most of the things that's able to do as far as a sampler. One thing we didn't really get into too much was that, you know, if you've got a bunch of samples, of cello samples that you want to map out on here so that, you know, that one was A4 and it's going to cover such a range, and then you're going to have another sample that's up higher and samples that are down lower, that you're going to select the root note, you know, to match the same frequency and note that you recorded the sample, and then map a key range for it so that you can fill out the range of the cello, whatever instrument you're trying to map onto the sampler. But that's pretty simple. So we're going to end this video and we're going to take a look at another sampler in the next video. Peace, hope, love.